Hello. This is a bit of something different than anything I've done on at least this channel, but there are some thoughts that I want to share in regards to, well, some obvious things based on the title, which is quote unquote trans rights versus trans liberation. So I think my position, I think based on all the imagery leading up and in this video, I think my position is somewhat clear, which is that I think quote unquote trans rights are phony in a sense, but I'll get to that, what I mean exactly, in a second. So wanted to originally make this an article on my website, but I want more people to see this, and my website doesn't really have all that much reach, and it's kind of like tucked away in places, so unless you go looking for it or I put on my homepage or something, I don't really think many people would see it. But I really wanted this to be like kind of easily accessible, so that's why I'm making this as it is. So basically, first point I have is, which it reads, rights won in a bourgeois society, what we live in, at least in the West, which is where, the most of the issues are being had, but of course it's a billion times worse in like the global South, can be rolled back anytime, like with workers' rights or other minority rights, as has happened in the past, and as is happening now. So basically, the trans rights movement gained trans people us a certain right? And this existed within, kind of bourgeois capitalist society and existing within patriarchal society, which I will touch upon a bit later in my arguments as well. So basically how, kind of rights and reforms work in a kind of capitalist society from a Marxist perspective is basically that the bourgeoisie or ruling classes will grant the oppressed classes or the proletariat certain rights as their struggle intensifies, kind of as little treats or I don't know, treats, I guess is a good way to put it, to placate the workers or other oppressed people, so that way they don't push for ever more radical demands. However, whenever the struggle wanes or the system is in decay, they may use these rights that were given to them as kind of like, I don't know how to say this, but basically as like something easily to be taken away and as like point of distraction. Which leads me into my next point, which transphobia, like racism, emerges from bourgeois society as a means of redirecting worker and oppressed thinking away from class consciousness. Fascism being the most extreme example of this. So yes, in fascism, they ramp up like racism, sexism, all these reactionary forms of thought to extreme degrees as a way of redirecting worker consciousness away from, their class enemy, the bourgeoisie who is exploiting them. They make them think something else is their problem, whether it be trans people or, Nazi Germany, Jewish people, or whoever is some minority, or gay people or whatever. And at the current moment, this scapegoat, which people of the right wing, or more generally the bourgeoisie, is using trans people as the scapegoat, in tandem with racism as well, which you see. But the most rabid and vitriolic and disgusting expression of this currently is directed at trans people. This is obviously seen particularly very explicitly in the United States, which kind of the Trump presidency and all of that is kind of an expression of king system, which leads me into my third point, which is escalation of transphobia and other forms of reactionary thought are evidence of a decaying system which should embolden us. Basically, as I've been saying, since transphobia and other, reactionary thoughts, racism, sexism, etc., are, expressions or means of distracting workers and oppressed people from class consciousness and other forms of consciousness against their oppressor. Whenever any sort of like transphobia and things like that are ramped up, it is evidence that, the system is, faltering in a certain sense. It's an expression of cracks in the system, that the system of imperialism and capitalism has cracks within it, and it's entering into yet another crisis. So in order to, prevent, the workers and other oppressed people from going to, the correct, which, is generally socialism, particularly Marxism, even more particularly Maoism, it redirects, the workers, the press masses, consciousness away from class consciousness into frivolous other things that really don't matter, because, what harm does, some trans person harm to some, I don't know, rural hillbilly or whatever, or really anyone, really. It's really, we're not all that much of a threat, like, really at all. But, like the Jews in Nazi Germany, or really any other minority in Nazi Germany, they scapegoat other people as the source of problems. The whole trans scare and, this scare about quote unquote woke ideology or whatever, that's textbook, fascist thinking and fascistic rhetoric, just textbook. But I will get a little bit into the minutiae of that a little bit as my last point. So basically, going back to my core argument, trans rights, quote unquote, or trans liberation. Trans rights, obviously I'm not saying, because I'm quote unquote against trans rights. What I mean by that is that I say trans rights shouldn't be the end all be all, because there's at least a significant portion of the trans rights movement that is very heavily focused on, trying to like gain respect and integration into society. But I feel like this would work more so in a socialist system where, there's an active struggle against patriarchal society and, the sources of transphobia and whatnot. Trying to, gain like integration into, an inherently transphobic or queerphobic society isn't really going to get you anywhere. You're not going to be successful because you're going to have like token rights, but it's not going to eliminate your oppression. And I think a very potent example of this is African Americans in the United States, or really anywhere in the West. Black and brown people. On paper, they have rights. On paper, oppression is illegal. But, it's particularly in the United States, black people are disproportionately represented in incarceration, and it's still technically legal to use slave labor if somebody's penalized. So, but that's is slavery abolished argument, which is something different. But my point with that is that basically black people on paper have civil rights now. The civil rights movement in that regard succeeded. However, in reality, de jure rights and quote-unquote liberation. But de facto, in reality, in the material world, black people, they're still an oppressed minority in the United States. So, obviously, because the whole root is that you're not going to get rid of racism just by, I don't know, trying to be respectable or ask for rights. That's not going to liberate you. Like, imagine if, the Palestinians started asking for the right to not get bombed or something. It's not going to do anything. Technically, it's, illegal to bomb Palestinian civilians under international law, yet they still get bombed. So, we shouldn't be focusing on a purely legalistic battle. We should also be emphasizing the necessity which brings me into my next point, which is that the trans liberation movement also needs to become linked up with the movement to overthrow capitalism, colonialism, and the patriarchal ideology burst from those systems. Because as I've been saying, without, striking those foundations, our oppression is going to continue, even if we have rights, quote unquote, which, can be taken away at any time, as has been very clearly portrayed in the United States and the UK. So it has to be linked up with those to combat the roots of transphobia, and so that way, there can be a genuine liberation, not token rights. And this brings me into my kind of last 2 points, which is firstly, the trans liberation movement should move to become more centralized, as in cooperation between different groups within countries and globally. So basically, if we want to succeed in, overthrowing capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy, well, these are very big things. We need to, first of all, start with, helping each other on a more grassroots level. Very something possible we can do. So that way we kind of have a network to support each other, but also be able to defend ourselves as well. This is very, very, very important. We must be able to defend ourselves in conjunction with being able to fight for our liberation and support each other. Very potent people or theories written about this, particularly Lenin and the experience of the Bolsheviks, I think is a key or very good example of how you can fight such a massive, wretched and rotten system, and succeed in overthrowing it. There needs to be kind of a centralized, or at the very least, a robust communications between different groups and coordination, so that way we can have the ability to advance the struggle successfully. Because if we're disunited, it's a lot easier to, pick us off one by one. But if we're united, we become a lot more difficult to break. So in addition to, uniting amongst ourselves, we also, I think, need to identify within broader society who are our genuine allies and who are our enemies. I think who our enemies are very clear. People who, are very blatantly transphobic or in other ways oppose our liberation. But also, I think there are also, false allies. People who, are, only really care for trans liberation as long as it's, respectable or things like that. Those are fake allies. Because the second we try to, advance, genuine liberation, those types tend to move over to the side of reaction rather than liberation, or in other scenarios, revolution. So then that leads me on to my last point. So-called conservatives should be denounced for what they are: reactionary liberals, not fascists or quote-unquote conservatives. They fundamentally follow the ideology of liberalism and haven't broke from it, and aren't working to conserve anything, but rather go backward, regress, and upend the current state of things in an aggressive direction. So this is kind of something I really wanted to say, which is that conservatives, quote-unquote, aren't really conserving anything now, are they? They're not trying to preserve the current state of things. If anything, a lot of the quote-unquote progressive liberals are conservative, because they're not really looking for change or progress. They're more so kind of more interested in keeping the state of things as they are, or progress so slow you don't even notice it. So basically no change. Whilst quote-unquote conservatives, they're very big on going backward. At least this is more so analysis of Western conservatism. But also, I say they are reactionary liberals, because the foundation of conservative ideology is capitalistic. It follows, liberal thinking, of liberal like economists, Adam Smith, and the lot John Locke or anything like that. And to call them fascist, I would argue, I've heard this argument before, and I agree with it. Is whitewashing liberalism if you call people like Trump outright fascists. They do use the rhetoric and strategies of fascism. But they don't constitute fascism itself. They haven't, upended democracy, well, quote unquote democracy, the sham bourgeois democracy, and stuff like that. They still kind of try and keep the veneer of, the existing order in a certain sense. That, bourgeois democracy, they haven't turned to outright dictatorship. And so it wouldn't be accurate, I think, to call them fascists. I think there could be an argument against me. I haven't really investigated this all too much, or all too well, I should say. So if anyone has a more compelling point of view, I would be very open to dialogue on that. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say, basically. Trans rights, they shouldn't be the end goal, is what I'm trying to say. The end goal should be trans liberation, and trans rights are merely a stepping stone in that direction. If we get trans rights, that is good. But it shouldn't be the end all be all. We should continue to struggle for genuine liberation and link this up with the struggles for, the overthrow of capitalism, colonialism, and the patriarchy, as I said. So that is all I wanted to say. If you have any opinions on this, you can leave a comment if you agree or disagree. I would be very interested in others' opinions, because I think this is a very important topic that we need to address at the moment for trans people. So, it's very important that we have this kind of ideological dialogue, and so that way we can better evaluate what is the best way forward for us. Also, as I said in the beginning, my general points I've been reading off of are on my website. There should be a link in the description, and yeah.